So welcome everyone. I'm Jennifer Tuttle. I'm the faculty director of the Maine Women Writers Collection here at the University of New England. And on behalf of the collection and UNE, I want to thank everyone for coming to the Donna M. Loring Lecture, which this year, as you know, takes the form of a panel discussion on racism in Maine beyond black and white. The panel will discuss the impact of institutionalized racism and cultural genocide with a focus on Maine's tribal communities. We're grateful to the panelists for participating. They will examine how, among other things, how the daily experiences of racism affect people's physical, mental, and spiritual well-being. There will be time, for sure, for conversation with the audience after the panelists share their remarks. So the four of them will speak, and we're going to go through that, and then we'll have discussion of everything at the end. I would like to acknowledge a few people and entities before we start and to say a few more words about the event. So bear with me, please, just for a moment. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, UNE's Office of Intercultural Student Engagement, as well as UNE's Women's and Gender Studies program, and USM's Women and Gender Studies program. And I especially thank the Maine Women Writers Collection curator, Kathleen Miller, without whom none of this would have happened, and similarly, Donna Loring. And the two of them work together to bring everyone together tonight. So thank you to both of you. I also want to thank Dave Dadiego and Carl Kerrigan, who are managing all of the myriad technological issues affiliated with this event tonight, and again, making it possible for so many more people to participate and enjoy it. I'd like to acknowledge as well UNE's Women and Gender Studies Student Club for hosting a live stream viewing on our Biddeford campus. So hi, everyone. Yes, and please come on in. There are still some more seats down here in the front. Recorded. Before we begin, then, just a few words about the Donna M. Loring Lecture. As many of you know, Donna Loring is Penobscot Nation tribal elder, and she served as the nation's representative to the Maine State Legislature for 12 years. Among her many accomplishments in that capacity was her sponsorship of the act to require the teaching of Maine Native American history in Maine schools, which has begun to address an urgent need in our education system and the culture at large. She's also the author of In the Shadow of the Eagle, a tribal representative in Maine, which was published by Tilbury House in 2008. Donna is the president of Seven Eagles Media Productions, which is a nonprofit whose mission is to eliminate cultural bias and institutional discrimination against Wabanaki people through supporting the accurate representation through media of Wabanaki culture and history. In 2011, she was recognized by UNE with a Deborah Morton Award, given to outstanding women who have achieved high distinction in their careers and public service and who are exceptional leaders in civic, cultural, and social causes. In 2009, Donna deposited her personal, professional, and literary papers to UNE's Maine Women Writers Collection, which is a special library collection of rare and unique material related to the lives and writing of Maine women. Come on in. There's some seats down here as well if you want to take one. It's perfectly fine. The Maine Women Writers Collection is housed here on the Portland campus of UNE. Donna Loring's papers comprise the first collection given by a Native American woman to the university. And we're deeply honored to hold the collection, not only because it's inherently special and valuable, but also because of all it allows us to do to support research and promote scholarship on Native issues, as well as to enrich educational opportunities for and about Indigenous peoples. We're profoundly grateful to Donna for honoring us in this way. A new notice this year that we were able to give at this event is that we're currently in the process of creating an endowment for the Donna M. Loring Lecture, and we're grateful to the leadership of the Maine Community Foundation for its significant help in launching this endowment fund and bringing it to within 70% of its goal. We also wish to thank Pam Cleghorn and Dr. Sandra Featherman for their generous contributions. We welcome donations to fully fund this endowment. And interested parties can contact our Institutional Advancement Department or speak to a Maine Women Writers Collection representative who will direct your question, and that would be myself or Kathleen Miller right here in the front. Hi, everybody. You can come on in. Hi, Lori. There are a few seats. Oh, there's one here. People can point to the seats next to them. So one final remark from me. The Donna M. Loring Lecture, which this is our 7th one that we've offered, I'm thrilled to say, highlights issues of concern to Native people in Maine and beyond. And it's one way we hope to acknowledge Donna for her generous gift. It's now my privilege to turn the podium over to Donna Loring, who will introduce the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, and good evening. And thank you for braving the rain to get out here. The lecture series tonight, I chose the topic because of what's happening in the state. In the past year, it seems like racism has really raised its ugly head in this state. I've written an article in the past, and well, a number of articles. But one of them was titled Maine, the Raceburg State. So Maine is the whitest state in the country, and we all know that. And so because of things that have happened in the state legislature within the past year, and I think there was just another incident a couple weeks ago of a House member making some racial slurs. So it's in our institutions, and it's time that we recognize that. So I'm going to introduce the panelists tonight, and I will say that originally I had asked my good friend Rachel Talbot Ross to be on the panel. But she has been under some really stressful times, and she just felt that she needed some time to have some rest and recuperation, and I certainly understand that. So our panelists today are Rabbi Rachel Isaacs. She serves as the spiritual leader of Beth Israel Congregation in Waterville, is the Jewish chaplain at Colby College. She additionally serves as a professor of Jewish studies at Colby. She received her ordination as a conservative rabbi from the Jewish Theological Seminary in 2011 and graduated from Wesley College in 2015. Now, Rabbi Isaacs was one of the three of us. There was me, Rachel, and Rabbi Isaacs that stood in front of the in the legislature when Senator Willett made his comments, and we had a press conference and called him to task for doing that. Our next panelist is Keita Whitten. Combines a training in social work and traditional psychotherapy with yoga and somatic experiencing in her practice, redefining therapy. Her approach honors the important role that reciprocity plays in the client-clinician relationship. Additionally, Keita has 10 years of experience leading educational diversity dialogues for nonprofits and higher educational institutions designed to address matters of race, class, and culture specific to Maine. Keita is also an artist. Now, our last panelist is very kind of strange, a white male. He's not that you're strange, Bob, but he's the police chief on Indian Island, and I've known Bob for many years, and he was police officer when I was police chief, so I sort of, he was under my mentorship. Turned out pretty well, I think. Robert Bryant has served as the police chief for the Penobscot Indian Nation since 2006. During his tenure as police chief, he has introduced a model of community policing, engaging community residents in proactive approaches to crime prevention. In 2015, Bryant was invited to participate in the President's Task Force on Policing in Washington, D.C. Bob has worked in law enforcement for 29 years, makes me feel old. He lives on Indian Island with his family, and you've lived there for how long, Bob? 28 years. Okay. So with that, I'm going to ask Keita to step up and talk to us for a few minutes.
It was funny. They was like, when you come up, make sure you're talking to the microphone. I was like, which one? The light? And she said, no, that's the light. I said, oh. I just thought it was kind of metaphorical, like, you know, talking into the light. I just want to pick up a piece. Spoke with Rachel today before coming, and also she sends blessings, but it was nice to know that she wanted me to be here, too. So I just wanted to share that piece. As an African-American clinician living in Maine, the issues of race and mental health has always been an area of grave concern for me, especially as a female in this profession, as I am also a minority, not due to race or gender, but also due to ideology and practice. What I share today comes from my professional and personal experiences. Today's focus is suicide. This is really weird. I've never done this with my glasses on, so this is like really weird. Today's focus is suicide. I am not an expert, and my statements are not to be definitive. In fact, if you leave here today with more questions, wanting more answers, then I have done my job in raising awareness. So I'm going to speak from a category of African American and Native American populations, especially as it relates to Maine. So there is some research just some statistics, the JAMA studies that I found really interesting. Pediatrics talked about the rates of suicide age 5 to 11 between the years of 1993 and 2012 for African American boys. That's 5 years old. And the same has also risen for suicide rates among black girls, or followed in the same trend. And what's interesting about that is because generally suicide has been like a white male, higher, and now we're seeing that younger children, especially 5, are committing suicide. One of the biggest factors they talk about in terms of, or we talk about in terms of suicide, is mental health, mental illness, which often is 90% is the case in 90% of completed suicides. There is a Native American psychiatrist, Dr. Walker, who specializes in American Indian psychiatric issues and is a Cherokee, who states he was overwhelmed that the toll of suicide rates is also happening on the reservations and Indian communities. And among this, the high rates are the ages of 15 to 24. Let's just think 15 to 24, so our young people, and then a higher rate now in the African American of 5-year-old boys. So what is the cause? Most clinicians and psychologists and helping professionals agree that the causes of suicide within these populations are complex and include a range of factors. While mental health plays a huge role, and there's often not enough resources, or they're in short supply and don't always reach the populations at risk. Most clinicians, including white and people of color, believe, well, you know, we think it's more of a socioeconomic issue, less about race and more about class. Some of the things we always hear, an overworked single mom or parent, they don't have access to care, the Great White Hope, substance abuse, family abuse, mental illness, social media. And yes, why these statistics, we know these statistics inside and out. Well, let's now move into considering something called race and PTSD. In America, I argue that you can't talk about race without talking about PTSD. Race and PTSD are huge when you consider the historical context. Post-traumatic slave syndrome is a concept first introduced by psychiatrist Dr. Alvin Poussin, who came here in Maine by the leadership of yes, she is a doctor, Rachel Talbot Ross, who brought him to McGeechee Hall to talk to distinguished physicians. I was fortunate to have met him. This term, post-traumatic slave syndrome, and then later on, we have a writer by the name of Dr. Joy DeGoy, who talks about, she is a clinical social worker such as myself, and her book, Be the Healing, the author of Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, America's Legacy of Enduring Injury and Healing. Before all this, early in the 70s, we had Naeem Akbar, who wrote a book called Breaking the Chains of Psychological Slavery. Now, we're talking about slavery, but this is all, we'll see, I'll bring you through the journey. What's important to highlight if we think about this history is what is the psyche, what has happened. When we look at the movie, The 12 Years a Slave, for example, we see a glimpse of the psyche in terms of the piece where we looked at the woman, the white woman, and her own internalized oppression as a result of what was happening. Anyone saw 12 Years a Slave? Do you remember that scene? Okay. So there's a collective burden happening here in terms of trauma and the psyche. But the question raised by Dr. Joy is, what is happening to the psyche of white people? What is happening when at the cost of one's own humanity, when you share the collective burden of genocide, terrorism, rape, torture, and systematic oppression for others? Let's just pause. Now let's revisit socioeconomics. Yes, I agree, suicide amongst our children is very complex, and the concept of socioeconomics requires a critical reflection of race and ethnicity as it relates to the American legacy of power, privilege, and oppression. Here's a little factor. In the, I think it's called Occupy Democrats, one of the statistics is that 80%, that's 80% of Americans only own 7% of the nation's wealth. Just think about that, right? In relationship to this, as Debbie Ford talks about, when we do not address our shadow side, our dark collective history of slavery, genocide, and exploitation, we will remain ineffective and divided. We act out and remain frozen in cognitive dissonance. A friend of mine once said, we never had a 10-step program that deconstructed slaves and masters and slaves. On one side, not embracing our shallow history as Americans, race will continue to be a tool, a red herring used to distract, while the income gap continues to widen as we continue to wipe ourselves out. If we consider suicide, depression, domestic violence, abuse, substance abuse, and homicide from the lenses I just quickly, we are a nation of disgruntled human beings. Pause. I'd like to revisit psychiatrist Dr. Dale Walker, the American Indian psychiatrist. When he felt overwhelmed by the toll of suicides that were taking on the reservations, he shares 5 years ago while he was visiting in the Northern Plains reservations, where they had recently suffered 17 suicides in 8 months. He was listening to a group therapy session, and there for the first time he heard the phrase, grieved out. One of the most difficult things to hear when the community says we can grieve no more. We're cried out. We can't respond anymore to the problem. I agree with Walker as he states he has become more attuned to this sense of being too exhausted to grieve with each new call call to an American Indian community that's facing an unusual high rate of suicide. As a helping profession, we never talk about how equally damaging it is when we as helping professionals do not actively deconstruct our own class and race bias. Think about how problematic this is when you're working with a therapist, psychiatrist, who chooses to ignore these aspects of our collective American identity. Isn't that crazy making? Let's pause here for a moment and ask, what does this statement mean? What I just painted in the mind and the youth of a child, of a 5-year-old child, when he or she thinks about their own future. That's it.
So everybody, thank you for being here. I'm really honored to be included in this group of individuals talking about an important topic. And when I was first invited to come and address this issue, I responded, what do I as a rabbi have to say on this topic? In what respect is the perspective of a Jewish woman, an openly queer woman, a rabbi, relevant? On one hand, there's a lot from the Jewish tradition. On the other hand, I'm very much a recipient of white privilege in everything that I do. So where does my voice fit into this mosaic? And I think it's important to begin just from the historical element of Jewish experience. My people have been a victim of genocide. That is part of what it means to grow up as a Jew from the earliest age, is knowing the trauma that the Jewish people have undergone with the 6 million lost in the Holocaust, but the many, many before that were killed and expelled from their homes. And it's part of the growing up experience as a Jew in the world. And part of the complexity of Jewish identity is, on one hand, realizing this history of victimization and genocide, and then on the other hand, for the American Jewish community, we don't deal with the same kind of discrimination that people of color do in the United States. Anti-Semitism certainly exists, but it's a very different type of discrimination, and the psychological scars are not the same. So it's this interesting in-between space of being a Jew, of having that historical experience, but also having different types of privilege that make allyship very rich but very complicated. And I think that one of the best examples of that is a famous rabbi who was a Holocaust survivor, who was very involved in the civil rights movement, named Abraham Joshua Heschel. And there's one quote by him that I always like to bring up because I think it's very beautiful in terms of the way that it integrates the Jewish experience, acknowledging the idolatry of racism, and the spiritual dimension that racism has. So he wrote, "Racism is worse than idolatry. Racism is unmitigated evil. Few of us seem to realize how insidious, how radical, how universal racism is. Few of us realize that racism is man's greatest threat to man, the maximum of hatred for a minimum of reason, the maximum of cruelty for a minimum of thinking." And that was written in 1963. And so it's chilling and resonant to hear that, because when you look at what is going on in the United States today, you think how little has changed in many ways. And from a Jewish perspective, I just want to talk a little bit about not necessarily the Jewish historical experience, but Jewish religious responses to racism and discrimination, in large part because one of the biggest problems that I see in discussions about racism and discrimination is there's a lack of an ability, I think, among primarily people who possess certain types of privilege to acknowledge the narratives of people who are oppressed. There's a real sort of reflexive insistence that it's not that bad, that it's not really happening, and no matter how many narratives we hear or how many facts we're confronted with, we're disinclined to actually accept the narratives of people who are suffering. And in this respect, Judaism has a lot to say on the topic. And this is actually very relevant to issues of GLBT issues, racism, classism, everything. In the Babylonian Talmud, which is really the core of what Judaism is, not the Bible, just it's important to know that. A lot of people think, well, Judaism is just the Bible without Jesus. No. But the Babylonian Talmud is really the heart and soul of Judaism. And it says, come and learn, human dignity is so important that it even supersedes a biblical prohibition. Human dignity is so important that it even supersedes a biblical prohibition. So even what is considered to be the word of God in traditional Judaism can be uprooted in order to preserve the human dignity of any individual. That's a huge theological statement, right? That any law can be superseded in order to preserve the dignity of an individual because of the core theological belief that all of us, regardless of race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, we're all created in the image of God. That's the amazing thing about human existence, is that in all of our diversity, phenotypic and otherwise, in the choices we make and otherwise, we're so diverse, and yet we all have this commonality of being created in the image of God, and that image is so precious that it has to be preserved. And so let me give two examples in Jewish law of how this comes up. One I found very interesting when I learned it as a rabbinical student that I found shocking, which is, for those of you who know anything about Judaism, Yom Kippur is our holiest day of the year, where we're required to fast. And it's really considered the pinnacle of Jewish spirituality and Jewish law. And according to Jewish law, even if 100 doctors tell you that you're capable of fasting on Yom Kippur, if you yourself feel that it will injure your health, you are prohibited from fasting. So even if 100 doctors say, really, I think you can handle it, if you yourself feel that you cannot handle that burden, not only are you allowed not to fast, you're prohibited from fasting. So think about that, right? About believing and having faith in your own narrative, which I think is a huge problem for people in traditionally oppressed communities, in addition to those who are recipients of privilege, is just believing the narrative. And I think that that's really important. The other issue that comes up for those of you who are aware of traditional Shabbat laws, traditionally you're not allowed to use electricity or assistive technologies on Shabbat. But an ultra-Orthodox rabbi actually allowed people to use electric devices to help them hear using hearing aids on Shabbat. And this was a very controversial decision that was come to in the 1950s. It's Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, one of the greatest Jewish legal scholars. And he said, for the sake of kavod habriot, for the sake of the dignity of all living things, a person should not in any way be demeaned in his eyes or in the eyes of others. So again, this willingness and this almost demand to upend biblical law so that you shall not be demeaned in your eyes or the eyes of others. This is the core religious concept. And I just think that it's important, as all these debates happen, you know, I'm keeping a close eye on what's happening at the University of Missouri and Yale and all these sort of things coming up, which is this idea of there are a lot of people who want to undercut people's narratives of pain that are very legitimate. And the question is there ever, at least from the perspective of my faith, a justification for abrogating the value of people's testimony of pain and oppression? And the answer is no. Not even for the direct word of God as found in the Torah. So I think that there are a lot of other people here that can speak to the lived experiences of people of color, the statistics and the personal experience of discrimination and pain. I think what I can bring as a spiritual voice from a Jewish voice is, I think it's upon us, it's our responsibility, all of us, regardless of who we are, to listen and to accept and to spend less attention trying to undercut the narratives and experiences of others, and more saying, I hear you, I respect you, and I see within you inherent value. So that's all. Thank you.
Okay. What I want to talk to you tonight about has to do with an event that's going to take place on Saturday at the Pleasant Point Native community near Eastport. But before I start talking about that, I came here early because I always have issues with technology. And I'm glad I came early because, yes, there's an issue. And I had planned on showing you a trailer, which is a really powerful trailer, but I can't get into it. So it just gives me a few more minutes, that's all. What I do want to say is that, the state of Maine, and I'm going to jump from this beginning into the Passamaquoddy issue. The state of Maine, from the very beginning, made the tribes invisible. And how they did that when they started out was right in the very language of the Constitution of the state. Now, in the Maine State Constitution, there's a little section that says that Article 10, Sections 5, 6, and 7 shall not be written. So you have a section of the Maine Constitution that you cannot read because it's not there. I mean, it's really there in law, but it's not there for you to read or to get to. And I challenge you to find it. Get on your computers and look for it. So, not in all of the sections, but I believe it's Section 5, some in Section 6, where Maine could not become a state without recognizing their obligation to the tribes, because the tribes fought on their side in the Revolutionary War. So that was part of the understanding that Maine could only break from Massachusetts if, in fact, it recognized its Massachusetts obligations. Maine would take that over into the Maine State Constitution, into Maine obligations. So they had to do that. But what they didn't have to do, and what they didn't do, was actually keep it in writing in their Constitution. Now, I'm wondering if the United States Constitution, you think you'd find something like that in that? I don't think so. So they can get away with it here in Maine when they want to make the tribes invisible. So along that thought, on Saturday, November 14th, that is the 50th anniversary of an incident that occurred on the Passamaquoddy Reservation. Was on November 14th in 1965. Now, back then, and also in 1965, I think it's also the anniversary of the Voting Act, Civil Rights Voting Act. So, in any case, that kind of stuff was going on. But there were these 5 white men from Billerica, Massachusetts. They were all high school friends and all on the football team together. And they decided to go on a hunting trip to Maine. So they arrived at Pleasant Point in that community early on early Sunday afternoon, and of course there's no hunting in Maine on Sunday. So the 5 men pull up to the residence of former tribal chief George Francis, who's 72 years old. His brother, Peter Francis, who's 58 years old and a veteran, and also employed as a nuclear technician at the base in Connecticut, was up visiting because he would do this annually. So, George was an older gentleman and former chief, and George was a veteran as well. So in the house were 4 girls, aged 17, 15, 13, and 11. They were studying in the back bedroom since they had class on Monday to attend. Now, these 5 men who said they were on their coming to Maine to hunt met George's cousin, I believe. His name is Chris Altivator, who helped them locate a place to buy beer, because this is on Sunday. And they didn't sell beer everywhere in that area. So after they got the beer, they returned to George's house, and they went into the house uninvited with their beer. They drank beer, and they asked George, and George didn't want to be rude. They asked him if he knew if there were any women around. And George says no. But one of the 5 men noticed the girls studying in the bedroom, and he offered one of the girls a chance to make some money. And George overheard it and told the guys to come out of there and leave the girls alone. Now, this happened 4 or 5 times after George had asked them to leave the girls alone. And finally, George says, "You leave my house, or I'm going to call the police." Chris and George encouraged the guys to get out, and they left. And they went up to Chris's house. And Peter, remember Peter is George's brother, Peter went up to Chris's house with the 5 whites, we'll call them white hunters. And the men began talking to the wife, Rita, in a manner that made her nervous. And at one point during this time, one of the 5 men slapped their 8-year-old son. His name was Kirk. And Rita saw this happen. And she was afraid to do anything because these were big men. They were in their 20s, and the oldest one was 32, and they're former football players, and they're pretty mean. So she was afraid to say anything. And Chris, the father didn't see this. He was in another room. But he said to Rita, in Passamaquoddy, in the Passamaquoddy languages, I smell a rat. These guys are making me nervous. Take the girls out. And in order for Chris's wife and daughters to leave, they have to ask one of the men to back his car out. So he goes out, and he goes to his car. And when he goes to his car, he takes young Kirk with him. And Rita was afraid. She testifies later that she was afraid to stop this from happening. But Chris doesn't know any of this stuff, and that his son had been struck by one of the men. So now they're driving around the reservation. There are 4 men back at Chris's house, and this one guy, his name is Ellingwood, drives Chris around the reservation and tries to get, and tells Chris, let's go shopping for girls. So they drive around, and they see a woman on the side of the road. And they stop and ask if she wants a ride. And she said no. So they continue, and they see another woman who Kirk knows. And Ellingwood tells Kirk to tell a woman to get in the car because Kirk's mother wants to see her. The woman gets in the car between Ellingwood and Kirk. Now at this time, it's getting dark, and they head back to the Altivator house. As they drive up over the hill towards the Eltivated house, they see figures on the side of the road, people walking and kind of like in the bushes. And Ellingwood slows down and shuts his headlights off. The woman in the car becomes afraid and jumps over Kirk and opens the door and runs off down the road. According to her later testimony, Ellingwood starts out to chase her, but changes his mind. And there are different accounts from here on about a fight. The fight breaks out, and Kirk testifies, and this is the 8-year-old, testifies that he sees Ellingwood hit Peter, the 58-year-old, in the back of the head with a knife. The child has now gotten out of the car and watches the events. He sees men beating his father, Chris, with a 2x4 and kicking him. The child screams, "Don't do that." And according to various witnesses who were there, including some of these guys, Ellingwood then says, "Let's get out of here," after he had hit Peter, and Peter fell to the pavement face down, and there was blood all over the road. They jumped in the car, and then they sped off towards their rented camp in Princeton. Now this camp, I mean this house, I mean this car that they were in, was their hunting vehicle that they drove there. And these are the hunters here. And let me see, yeah, this is their hunting vehicle. Now, if you know anything about hunters, they don't go hunting in a '62 white Cadillac. So they take off, and Kirk is, he's 8 years old, and he's dazed, and he runs into his house, and his father gets up and kind of staggers into the house. And at this point, Peter is lying in the road, bleeding profusely. Chris and another person, Rita's brother, call for help. They call the sheriff, who says he's busy with another job. Says he can't respond to the fights that you guys get into. Chris then calls the state police, who decline to respond and suggests calling the deputy sheriff. They call him, and he says that he can't leave his post for a frivolous fight. The tribal constable, Ray Moore, is on patrol that night, and he doesn't usually, he usually patrols a certain pattern, certain route, and he sees Peter Francis' body in the road, and he stops, and he gets out, and he checks Peter and sees how horrible his condition is, and then he runs in the house because he wanted to get a blanket and see what had happened. So Peter is still lying there, and in the meantime, Chris Eltivader's brother shows up and goes down and tells George, the 72-year-old, that his brother is in the road. George comes up, finds his brother. One of the 17-year-old girl who was in George's house studying also comes up to help. And she calls the regional hospital for an ambulance. And the hospital says, "We're not an ambulance service." Now, Constable Ray Moore calls the sheriff and the state police, and finally they respond an hour and a half later. Chris Eltivader's first call to them, they respond, and they arrive, and they take Peter to the hospital. Now, at this point, everyone goes to the hospital, including Chris Eltivader, including all the law enforcement officers. So there's nobody left on that scene to secure it. And if you watch enough TV, you know, that in a situation like this, someone stays and secures the scene and gets the evidence. That didn't happen. The same night, the troopers there's two of them in the Eastport area, they get a call from the Orono headquarters, and they tell the troopers to pick up the suspects who are at camp. So the troopers, they go and they bring the native constables with them and they question these guys. And did they take them into custody? No. They just made sure. They said, well, you're going to be around tomorrow? Guy says, oh yeah, we'll be here. So they leave them. Later that night, the tribal constables meet with the district attorney. This is about midnight or so, and the district attorney tells the constables to go back to the scene and collect evidence. So they went back and they found a bloody 2x4, bloody glasses. They put that in the trunk, whatever. And the next morning, Peter Francis dies. That afternoon, they took photos of the evidence, and the troopers returned to the camp to interview these 5 hunters. In Massachusetts, they read them their rights for the first time, and they still didn't take them into custody. The troopers asked the 5 men to go to the DA's office in Calais the next day to speak with them, and they agreed. So they stayed over the next day. So they had a conference with the perpetrators, with the guys from Massachusetts, the state police, the DA. They had a little talk. They had murder warrants were issued, but they were never served. And they weren't served because the guys said, we're not going to go anywhere, we'll stay here. So the DA said, well, they're not going anywhere, and so we're not going to serve the murder warrants on them. And in the meantime, a guy named Don Jellers, I don't know if you're familiar with that name, but he was called because the DA wasn't going to do anything. So he called and he told the DA, if you don't do anything, I'm going to call the papers, the Portland Press, because he knew this guy at Portland Press, and he knew that he was fair and he wanted justice. So he called the Portland Press, and the story came out in the paper. And it was funny because the reporter talked to the district attorney and really pressed him about why they didn't serve the murder warrants, why they were never issued. And the guy said something to the effect that there was no proof that a murder was committed, and that it would be a waste of taxpayers' money to serve a murder warrant. So that's why he didn't do it. They had a grand jury. They indicted one of them, Ellingwood, on a very low count of manslaughter. The trial was held, and by the way, 2 days before the arraignment, the district attorney talked to these guys and told them exactly what the charges were going to be, and told them who was going to be charged, and told them how much bail money it would take to get this guy out of jail. So they had time to go back to Massachusetts, get the bail money, come back, and bail the guy out. So the trial was held 2 months later. Ellenwood is acquitted after 2.5 hours of deliberation by an all-white jury. The courtroom breaks into cheers and applause. 6 years later, at age 50, Chris Eltivator commits suicide. As Colin Woodard reported, Chris was never the same after the beating. He hanged himself in his basement in 1971. 7 years after his father's suicide, and after bouts of severe panic attacks, doubling over, shaking, and stuttering, Kirk Eltivator takes his own life in 1979 at the age of 22. Now, I had never heard the story before until I read the 29 articles that Colin Woodard had written in the paper. And let me see, I wanted to show some of the headlines of the articles. County attorney denies any heel-dragging probe of Maine Indian's death. Action likely before weekend in Indian's death. Indicted death of Indian. And the related beatings. It was all Indians. They never really named Peter Francis. He wasn't a person. He was an Indian. And that's the way it's been for Indian tribes in Maine, not being recognized as people. Indian boy testifies. And so now on Saturday, they're having a remembrance of this event 50 years ago. The great-grandson of Peter Francis is Corey Hinton, and he's an attorney for Aiken Gump out of D.C., and he is looking for justice 50 years later for his family. And they're holding this event on Saturday, starting at 2 at the Pleasant Point Reservation, and they will be making a historic announcement at that time. So that's all I have to say. And Bob, you're next.
Well, good evening. Some of you that came in and saw the signs that led you here, I don't know if you saw what it said. It said Donna Loring Lecture this way. Well, that's what I thought Donna's last name was for many years when she used to be my boss, was Lecture, because that's all I used to get from her was I was a young officer out of the Criminal Justice Academy, and being naive and having the wrong idea of what policing should be. Donna lectured me many times on what I shouldn't be doing. So, but in all seriousness, what Donna just talked about is the problems that we have in Maine law enforcement today. And I can tell you that I'm probably one of the few in my positions as a law enforcement executive that will actually get up and state that. And I am proud to do so, in that, you know, law enforcement in Maine and across this country has changed dramatically over the last, say, 30 to 40 years, mostly in, you know, the technology and the equipment used to do the job. Where it has stayed the same is the lack of education and of different cultures and races in the training for law enforcement in that area. And when doing that, what we create, especially here in Maine, is, whether you want to admit it or not, and I'm talking about the law enforcement society, as Donna stated, Maine demographically is a white state, and when you say that, you know, in this discussion, white people get defensive. The first thing they're saying is, so what does that mean? It means just that. So with that, rather than being defensive, there's a responsibility that goes with that. And that responsibility is to understand that there are other races that live in this state. And it's a responsibility to educate and learn the different cultures and races that we live with, and that we as law enforcement have a duty to service. So, you know, looking back, it took me a long time to understand why is it so difficult to really implement true community policing. Now, when we talk about community policing, that is a paradigm that law enforcement always goes back to whenever there's a serious issue with society. Oh, we got to get to community policing. Community policing, it has to be community-oriented policing. Well, there's never, ever, ever going to be true community policing in Maine or in this country until you first have the foundation of legitimacy and trust. And when you deny the recognition and acceptance of any race, no matter how small in number, then there's never going to be legitimacy or trust when it comes to viewing law enforcement. So when we look at Maine and we look at how Maine is training their law enforcement officers and how they go out and service the people of this state, to include all races, we have a broken system. Maine, along with the rest of this country, law enforcement is a broken system. And if some folks out there that hear this, that are in my profession, you know, they're going to scoff at it. But it is. I talk about the advancement in technology. It's like taking a jet engine and you have all these panels and you have all this technology to guide this plane, this jet plane, but you still have a steam engine inside of it. That's what we're working with, because we are failing to understand people in general. We're failing to recognize cultures and failing to recognize, you know, people and how we have to work and service those people. We are trained in academies that are militaristic in style. They mimic and emulate the military. And that is wrong. We are not the military. We are supposed to be servicing people. We're not supposed to be occupying the streets of this country. And when you look at it, you don't have to go too far to see some of these signs. When surplus military equipment is being given to law enforcement to patrol the streets, I mean, you look at it, it's similar to what's happening in Iraq and these other countries. We are not the military. And until we recognize that the system is broken, we're never going to be able to get true community policing. Now, we try to address that on a daily basis. And when I look at, you know, I do pride myself in community-oriented approach. But again, I kept struggling with saying, why don't I get the people to buy into this? Why isn't the citizens of the Penobscot Nation buying into this? Because it goes back to what I saw when I first saw this trailer. And the grandson of Peter Francis was on there, and he broke down and started to cry and said, "It'll never change. It will never change." And what he meant was that the justice system across the country, but I want to talk about the justice system in Maine, has failed the Native people since the beginning of them coming here and beginning to police and be a part of the community of the Native communities. So that historical trauma is in place, and until we make those needed changes, we're never going to have true community policing. It's not going to happen, because we have to have people to trust us, and we have to be viewed as being legitimate. And at the end of the day, it's about how do we as a people want to be serviced by law enforcement? Do we want our law enforcement, so when we see them on the side of the road, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? It does me, and I'm a law enforcement officer. Fear. Fear. And I can only speak for myself, but as a person of color that travels the roads of Maine in this country, that is even multiplied the first thing that pops in your head when you see law enforcement, I would hope it would be, well, there's somebody that is a part of me. The police should be the community should be the police. It's not that way. So the system is failing. And so when we look at and we talk about institutionalized racism, and when we know that it does occur and it is in place, what happens when you have that is it's producing individuals with implicit bias. And those people, and when I talk about that, I'm talking about police officers. We send out police officers from our academy that don't know that they're being racist because that's how the institution works. Now, a prime example of that is we have a criminal justice academy that has an executive board that's made up of 17 agencies and some civilians. For 2 years, we've attempted to get a tribal law enforcement executive on that board to try to begin to bring some racial diversity to the board that's training police officers that are going out into this state and servicing the people. And not only did we lose in the legislature for 2 years in a row, but we were opposed by the Criminal Justice Academy themselves. So when you look at that, and you look at that board, and there's not one person of color on that executive board, the system is broken. And when you won't admit that there's a problem, it's even worse. So it not only creates problems for all of us, but specifically my profession. I grew up wanting to be a police officer ever since I was a little kid. Now, I'm going to date myself, but I used to watch a show called Adam 12. And to me, watching that show was about, that's what I want to do. I want to service. I want to help people. But when I went to the academy as a young man, I'd been through boot camp in the Army, so I knew what the military was. And I got into the police academy. It was like the Cub Scouts of the military. I was like, this is not what I thought I was going to get. This is not what I thought policing was about. And it continues to this day. And when we go down and we try to affect change, but because of what is in place in the institutionalized racism that is in place here in Maine, it's an uphill fight, but we're not going to stop. I just had a service for my mother-in-law, who was a proud Penobscot woman. Her name was Sipsis, and she stood about probably 5 foot, maybe 5 foot and a half of an inch tall. And I said at her service on Saturday that I would continue to talk about this issue, and I would continue in her name to fight for tribal sovereignty and to try to enhance tribal sovereignty, because we aren't going to continue to have the tribes be invisible in this state. We are going to change it. We're going to change it for all people of color, because, again, the system is broken, and we need everybody to be a part of changing it. So I want to thank you for allowing me to come and talk with you tonight, and I'll close.
We have about 20 minutes for questions. So if you have a question or you want to engage panel, just raise your hand and we'll come to you.
Because we are going to ask everyone to speak into the microphone, as I said before. So just signal to us if you would like to ask a question or make a comment. Miku.
This is for you, Keita. I was wondering, you're talking about the deconstructing of our internalized racist frameworks. Are you aware in your profession of any training or any trends that are, coming about to address that?
Good question, Miku. Thank you. I'm not aware of any trainings. I do think so. As a social worker, we have these guidelines and ethics, codes of ethics, and we have something called a cultural competency, or it's a separate code of ethics. And first of all, it's always interesting to me, like, why do we have like this cultural competency thing separate from our code of ethics? Like, that's a really red flag right there, especially if you understand the genesis or the understanding of what social work is. But then again, that's questionable too. If we really think about social welfare and who started, which were white middle-class women, and it was really about, from what I understand, reforming and being part of, helping the destitute and speaking proper English and what's her name? Ellie, the woman who does the whole book about etiquettes and that stuff. So like, if you really look at that, I remember like really being shocked by that. I think that one of the reasons why I'm here and can look at it from this perspective, and Sue Evans was a part of that, is some of the work that I was fortunate to be a part of as an undergrad at University of Southern Maine, where I was trained as an anti-oppression peer educator. Woo, woo, woo. And it's a program that's no longer funded. I wonder why. And we founded what was now called the Multicultural Center, but back then the Alana Center, Asian, Latino, Native American Center, and it had a real social justice focus. I was through that training that the thing I took away, Miku, is about that we each had to deconstruct our own biases. And it's a piece of that training that I have always taken with me into my work and still take with me today. So are there any trainings around this specifically? No. I've done some trainings in Maine trying to address this issue. I would like to see more of it done amongst us as clinicians and psychologists and psychiatrists particularly, especially when we're using these archaic models of psychobabble, I'll say, in terms of how we address mental health, but we don't even look at the pictures of like the socioeconomics and the issues of race. We just saw the narratives and the stories and the PTSD, that historical piece. And the other piece that's really important about that I want to emphasize is white people are not void of that. This issue is not a people of color burden. And that's part of the cognitive dissonance that is alive in this room today when we don't address that history. We don't address our dark shadows as Americans.
So you all are talking about the work ahead in needing to deconstruct racism and institutional oppression. But I feel like in Maine we've taken so many steps backwards with the level of discourse, if you can even call it that now, where it's completely antagonistic and racially charged. So I'm curious as to your thoughts about how we even get past that to be able to do the work that needs to be done.
I don't know why I get all these questions, the hard ones.
Got you back.
Thanks. But the way that I see it is we have to keep on keeping on regardless of what we think you think. You know what I mean? If I had to worry about what someone's going to say, what someone's going to react, how they were going to react, if they were going to, I wouldn't even get out of bed in the morning. So it's one of those things where we as people of color, we cannot stop, because if we do, it's going to be the end of us. We have to keep on, and it's just that simple.
I'd like to add that, yes, the keeping on and the frame that I use in practice is recovery, that we're all in recovery, and that every day, if you think about the AA models or recovery models, sobriety is about the fact that every day I'm working to deconstruct my racism in my classes. And this goes for me as a person of color, and it goes for people who identify as white. So I just want to keep it in that context, that it's a continuous, everyday piece of work. How many hundreds of years have we been mired in this?
If I could just, two things that I'd want to contribute. I think that there's a spectrum. So I think that there's the extremes that exist in Maine and exist more generally. I've experienced this as a rabbi. I lost a congregant over the summer after the murder of Michael Brown. Somebody in my congregation said, everything that you're referring to, Rabbi, is just an urban myth. And I was like, okay, that's the end of that. I tried to heal that relationship because as a rabbi, all these people are my congregants. I realized that was probably beyond. But that's an extreme. And then I think there's a huge spectrum between people who are really on board and people who are really resistant. And I think that while there are people on the extremes that we can't let ourselves be kept back from having our integrity and fighting the way that we need to, for the people that are in the middle of that spectrum, I don't think we should give up. And I think that that's actually, for churches and synagogues and mosques and other houses of faith, I think that's a unique role that we can play. That's a unique role we can play in that they're ideologically diverse communities that are brought together in the pretext of common values. And I think it's worth having those conversations with anybody, even if they disagree with you. Just keep on having the conversation. I think that's really important. The other thing that I would say is one of the things that I think Judaism has contributed to the way that I interact with the world is that the value of debate and discourse across lines of difference is considered to be the holiest path to God. Wherever two people debate the words of God, God dwells between them. So I think it's about embracing the debate and not being afraid of it, which doesn't mean giving in. It doesn't mean compromising, but still having those conversations. Because I think once we start writing off huge numbers of people as potential allies or people whose hearts we can change, then we're in trouble.
Finally, I think that you said the antagonistic comments and the attitudes. Well, it's something we don't, some of this inappropriate language and verbiage and actions, we don't accept that from children. Why should we accept it from adults? And I think what it is about standing up and having the courage to tell people, no, that's unacceptable. And until we, as a society, start to be louder, because I hear it all the time, oh, you're just a liberal. Well, no, that's not the case. The case is that what you're saying is wrong, and I'm going to point it out. When it's wrong, I'm going to have the courage to tell you that.
I'd just like to add, I appreciated your question and how you all answered it, but I think as a white person of privilege, I think it's important to also ask ourselves what we can do instead of, I hear a lot of these questions being raised with community members of color. Well, what can we do? And again, to place that burden to come up with the resources and the answers for us, I can only imagine that must be so tiresome, and I appreciate your willingness because that's huge. I do know if people are interested, there are 2 things coming up that support both the Native Americans and people of color and the communities that we're in tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. Monument Square. There will be a solidarity event for the people of Missouri, and it's initiated through people of color here in Portland, so we can show up in solidarity for that. Also, next Thursday on the USM campus, there'll be a screening about the Penobscot River case. And I know they're still looking for people to get involved and support those efforts with the rights of the Penobscot people being taken away from them with our taxpayers' money in the state of Maine. So there's 2 things that, if people want resources and how to find these and more information on these events, I'm certainly, you can talk to me after. So. There's a film screening next Thursday. Wednesday? Thank you for correcting me. Thank you for correcting me. Oh, okay. Well, we can figure that out after if people are interested. No, thank you. University of Southern Maine. 6, thank you. And then tomorrow evening at 6 p.m. in Monument Square in Portland.
We'll be at the Shepley Auditorium with Maria Gerard.
The event will be at the Shepley Auditorium from about 6 to 8. Maria Gerard will be there. She will also update us on the case, and should be a pretty good discussion. There are other support groups, and this will be the one on Wednesday, right? I have so many events next week. I'm like all confused. I'd have to look on my calendar, but yeah, it will be at Shepley Auditorium. It's in the Wishcamper area, Wishcamper building.
At USM. Yeah. So we're going to go over there and then we'll come back here.
Hello. Thank you all for what you shared. It was great. I have a question, or I guess it's a question for all of you. And speaking of Missouri, I guess I wanted to ask if some of you can elaborate for people who feel disconnected with, I guess, what's going on, and people feeling like, okay, I see what's going on TV, but how does that relate to me in Maine? And also, if you guys have any information in terms of like the incidents that were happening on Colby not too long ago, and Yik Yak, and just the ways that things just, I guess, discrimination and racism continue to perpetuate, and it's seen on campuses. So I guess overall, if some of you can speak to that.
I think it kind of piggybacks. It's Bob. Bob said, okay. The piece around standing up. So why there is never a disconnect, and I can't tell you how many incidences we have had, we continue to have and have had here in Maine at Deering High School. The posterings of missing. It was a little blonde girl, and it said missing white girls, but meaning that there's no more pure little white girls. And the issue of the gorilla in a bathing suit that was depicting an African American. I mean, this just wasn't too long ago, and the impact here. Want to go back to in terms of Maine, we've had a numerous amount of young males of color suicide. I know 3 of them in the last 10 years that I'm aware of that are in our small communities. These are not isolated events. I guess that's what I'm really trying to say. And the pieces in Colby and USM and Deering and Portland High, they continue. I think the thing I would just remind us, again, is what Bob's saying around, if we're seeing stuff right now, you leave campus, you go outside when a cop has stopped not just a student of color, but a young person in a car, stop and pay attention. See what's happening. Be a witness. See what's in schools when you hear the racial slurs or the stuff, and teachers go, like the deer in the headlights. What's happened to that kid who's been like the boy in the story you showed? What's the impact of that when we as the adults don't stand up and say, that's not okay? We don't have the courage, and have the courage to even go to our principals. Oh, I know what happens. We get fired, right? I don't know. I don't know what our value is as American people in terms of other people's lives and values. It really comes down to that. We have seen it time and time again where many people have lost their lives in the name of these fights. Do I say go outside and get yourself killed? But it's very real. And that's the part that's uncomfortable. And until we get more uncomfortable, talk about broken system that has been broken for how long, it's going to stay this way. The only way is to show up each and every day and represent and be a voice and say, no, 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 no.
I think knowing that looking back at the fight that we continually have on trying to get change when it comes to the Native issues, it's about saying you have to step up even as people of non-color and say, if I know it's wrong, I'm going to step and stand beside you. We've been looking for that for years. I know Donna and I have had that discussion on who do we find to help champion our causes? Who do we look to help stand with us and to affect change? And that's what it's about. It's about affecting change. And it has to be done with masses, because that's the truth of it all. This country, whenever there has been change, it's because the people have taken to the streets, per se. And it's not because one or two people have gone and said, hey, could you change this for us? It doesn't happen. It's about demanding change and having the numbers and people, because I'll tell you, when people of privilege start to see things happening in their neighborhoods, that's when change happens. And I'm not saying about burning things or loot. It's about standing up as a collective voice. It's about being unified and saying what is happening is wrong, and we're here to say that we are going to change it.
I think that I can specifically address some of the things that have happened at Colby, and I know that similar things have also happened at Bowdoin. I think that these issues are happening at colleges and universities across the country, and none of them are isolated, because it's all part of the American story. And I just don't think that we should be, and most of us are not in this room at least, we're not surprised when we see these things erupt, because there is this festering wound of racism that people prefer not to address, people prefer not to see, and by people I mean mostly people, white people, people of privilege. The people who have the ability to look away usually do. And in the case of what happened at Colby last year, I mean, it's sort of the positive and the negative elements of social media, because on one hand, I think apps like Yik Yak do terrible things in terms of maintaining human dignity, because people can say horrendous things without any accountability, which makes it incredibly hard to respond. So you have a lot of hurt and not a lot of accountability, which I think is terrible. On the other hand, lest anybody fool themselves to think, oh, we're in this idyllic campus in rural Maine, and we just don't deal with those problems. Those aren't our problems. Racism isn't here. When everybody saw those screenshots or saw what was happening on Yik Yak, it's here. It's everywhere. And I think we see it's all interconnected. It's happening in Maine. I think that there are two ways that we can respond. One is political, which is essential. The other way that I think is important is pastoral. And as a rabbi, I think the pastoral is political, and that's one of the ways in which I show allyship as a person who receives privilege. So a lot of my colleagues of color on the faculty, I can see the exhaustion and the pain in their faces because there's all this unpaid labor of supporting students of color that white colleagues either don't or won't extend that kind of support, and so there's this huge burden. And so what my wife and I try and do is drop off food or send a text message saying, I see you're in pain and I care. And we try and do the same thing for students of color because I think being a student of color at a place like Colby is an incredible burden. And when I see students of color succeed academically at Colby, I'm always incredibly supportive because I know that they're working twice as hard to get to the same point. So I think that, you know, there's the issue of political activism, but also in that interconnectedness of showing love and showing care in ways that say, I understand you're carrying a heavier burden, and in the ways that I can alleviate some of that burden, I'm going to do whatever I can, even if it's not public, even if it's not recognized, because it's a heavy burden to carry with the same responsibilities as other Colby students.
I hate to say this, but we're up against the clock. And so we have you wanted to make a comment or ask a question? I feel badly, I'm sorry. There's so much more to say, but I just wanted to say quickly how moved I was by all of your presentations and how much I appreciate your willingness to come out here and share what you had to say, and also how incredibly, really in ways, some that I expected and some that I didn't, how incredibly moved I was by how much your remarks intersected with one another. So thank you very much. Donna, did you have any final remarks that you wanted to make? Don't mean to put you on the spot, but I just didn't want to end without giving you the last word.
You sure you want to?
I am.
You know.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Hey.